Are you certain that the luxurious fabrics in portraits of European nobility were truly created by those we read about in textbooks? What if what we see is not a triumph of craftsmanship, but the trace of a massive deception, hidden for centuries behind beautiful words about progress, trade, and skill? What if silk, velvet, brocade, and lace in such quantities could not have been produced through official means at all? And then a question arises that sends a chill down your spine. Where did all of this actually come from? In this video, we will unpack what is usually whispered about or not spoken of at all. Why the math doesn't add up even at the level of a single dress. Why old fabrics have survived the centuries better than many modern materials. Why archives are suspiciously silent where mountains of documents should have remained. And why some basements of old palaces look less like utility rooms and more like secret vaults for things outsiders were never meant to see. The most unsettling part begins further on. When we add to the fabrics the vanished shipments, impossible patterns, strange reforms by rulers, and a theory that sounds too insane to accept immediately, yet too logical to simply dismiss. There's a feeling that the aristocracy didn't create this luxury. They merely appropriated it. And closer to the end, I'll show why this thought no longer looks like fantasy. Have you ever noticed a strange thing when you look at formal portraits of old European nobility for a long time? At some point, you stop looking at the faces. Your gaze drifts lower, to where the main performance begins. Not the expression in the eyes, not the pose, not the coat of arms on the wall, but the fabric. That very fabric, which on the canvas looks too alive, too intricate, too expensive even for our time. The silk doesn't just shine, it seems to glow from within. The velvet isn't just dark. It falls into such a deep, almost bottomless shadow that it appears denser than the paint itself. The gold embroidery doesn't look like decoration. It looks like a display of power, translated into the language of material. And the lace is rendered with such precision that you can't help but think, the artist couldn't have invented this. He saw it. And this is where it gets most interesting. We've been taught since childhood to perceive such luxury as a natural part of the past. Sure, there were kings, palaces, and master craftsmen who wove, dyed, and sewed it all. It sounds familiar, comfortable, even beautiful. But if you linger on the details a little longer, an uncomfortable question begins to stir in your mind. Could all of this really have been created in that era, with the means we're told about? Not individual rare items, not singular ceremonial outfits, but entire wardrobes, entire courts, entire countries, drowning in fabrics of this level. Look more closely at the folds, the shimmer, the heavy, multi-layered sleeves, the embroidered bodices, the patterns that flow with such confidence, as if what's before us isn't clothing, but architecture made of threads. This doesn't look like the product of a world where everything was done slowly, by hand, and in limited quantities. On the contrary, it looks as if behind these people stood access to something enormous, to reserves, to technologies, to capabilities that fit poorly with the familiar picture of the past. The most astonishing thing is different. In the portraits, this is not a rare exception. It's a system. Luxurious fabric repeats again and again, from painting to painting, from country to country. Styles, faces, dynasties change, but the feeling remains the same. What we see is not just wealth, but wealth on an industrial scale. And here, you can no longer get away with words about good taste, the skill of artisans, and the nobility's love for beautiful things. Because beauty is only the surface. Beneath it hides a question that shatters the calm of this picture. If these materials were real, where did they come from in such quantities? To avoid arguing on the level of impressions, we must now do what no one usually does. Set aside emotions, put admiration on hold, and turn to cold, hard numbers. Because it's the numbers that very quickly begin to say what the portraits have only hinted at so far. Once you replace admiration with a calculator, the formal beauty immediately loses its innocence. One noblewoman's dress is not a piece of fabric and a couple of ribbons. It's a multi-layered construction requiring dozens of meters of material. A heavy skirt, lining, outer layer, trim, train, sleeves, inserts, decorative elements. Even by the most conservative estimates, a single outfit required as much fabric as an ordinary family of that time might not see in a lifetime. Now imagine not one dress, but a wardrobe. Not the bare minimum for festivities, but a full set for court life, receptions, outings, seasonal changes, new fashion demands. An aristocratic woman didn't have just a few such outfits. She had dozens, then hundreds. For the most prominent figures, the count reached incredible numbers. And it's not about wearing one successful dress for 20 years straight. Court society lived by different rules. Yesterday's style was already considered outdated. What recently stunned with its luxury quickly became an item for alteration, remaking, or passing down to someone of lower status. This is where the real fracture in the familiar version begins. If even one wardrobe requires a huge volume of expensive fabric, how much was needed for an entire court? And if you take not one court, but all the nobility of a major kingdom, and if you add neighboring countries where the same thing was happening, what we have before us is no longer a matter of fashion and taste. It's a flow of raw materials on such a scale that it should have left a trace the size of an era. And the next question arises on its own. If fabric was required in such volumes, constantly, without stopping, then somewhere there must have existed a system capable of producing it all. Not a pretty picture from a textbook, but a real mechanism that day after day fed luxury to all of Europe. And here, the official picture begins to crumble, not by feeling, but by pace. We are shown workshops with weavers at wooden looms and asked to believe that this is how the luxury that filled palaces was born. The picture is beautiful, almost cozy. It just has one problem. It can't withstand even the simplest calculation. A hand loom worked slowly, especially when it wasn't about coarse everyday cloth, but dense, expensive, complex fabric with precise patterns and even weave. Such material couldn't be rushed. It required hours of concentrated work, care with every pass, attention to every thread. One master could produce only a few meters a day, and that under ideal conditions. Not on holidays, not during seasonal pauses, not in real life, with illnesses, defects, and material shortages, but in an almost laboratory model. Now, let's return to the needs of the nobility. One large wardrobe already amounts to thousands of meters of fabric. Several royal courts, tens of thousands, an entire country, volumes that would have required the labor not of individual artisans, but of a giant army of producers. And without pause, because clothing was constantly renewed. Fashion didn't wait. Court life didn't stand still. Demand never dropped. And here, an uncomfortable question arises. Where were these endless rows of workshops? Where are the cities that lived solely by weaving? Where are the traces of the vast system that should have operated like a factory assembly line long before the age of machines? We're asked to believe that all of this was made by hand, almost domestically. Yet the sheer scale of the luxury itself suggests the opposite. And even that isn't the main blow. Suppose someone, by some miracle, solved the problem of volume. Then we're left with something even harder to explain. Because it's not just about quantity, it's about the level of these fabrics and why so many of them still look as if time passed them by. The preserved fabrics of the past cast doubt not only on the volumes, but on the very level of technology. Just visit a museum displaying old costumes, ceremonial robes, or fragments of court embellishment, and you can almost feel it physically. What you see isn't just old cloth. It's an object that for some reason has survived the centuries better than many items from recent decades. The threads don't crumble to dust at a touch. The colors don't look dead and faded. The patterns haven't blurred, vanished, or turned into pale shadows of themselves. On the contrary, these fabrics often retain that very density, that depth, that sense of a finished object which the modern eye instantly recognizes. Even when it's not a whole dress, but just a piece of old cloth, one still feels the difference. And here's what's especially awkward for the conventional historical narrative. We're constantly told that production back then was cruder, slower, and simpler. So why, in many cases, does the result look more convincing than that of an era with laboratories, chemistry, automation, and industrial lines? Why do antique fabrics, having endured dampness, temperature fluctuations, transport, and storage in far from ideal conditions, still hold their shape and give the impression of high-class items? At this point, we can't just blame careful museum preservation. Before reaching the museum, these items lived long lives. They were worn, altered, hidden, transported, passed down, forgotten, and rediscovered. And yet, many have reached us in a condition that fits poorly with the story of primitive craftsmanship. Now for the main point. If the fabric itself is so durable, then the question isn't just about the weaver's skill. It also matters what it was dyed with. And that's where perhaps the most uncomfortable conversation of all begins. Because old dyes behave as if they were created according to rules we still don't fully understand. With dyes, the official version struggles even more. Weaving cloth is one thing. Giving it a color that doesn't fade after a couple of seasons, isn't afraid of light, and doesn't wash away with time is quite another. And that's exactly what we see in old fabrics. Deep purples, rich reds, dense blues. They look not like a trace of bygone luxury, but like its stubborn remnant, surviving centuries without dissolving. We're assured that all this was achieved with natural dyes. It sounds noble, almost romantic. But as soon as you start examining the origins of these colors, the elegant picture quickly becomes heavy. One dye required marine resources, another rare insects. A third was transported halfway around the world. Behind every saturated hue lay a long chain of extraction, transport, processing, and dyeing. And the brighter the color, the more complex the question. How many resources were needed to cover not just one ceremonial cloak, but the entire wardrobes of the nobility? Here's what's important. Even if we assume the raw materials were somehow delivered in sufficient quantities, the mystery of their durability remains. Why did these old dyes behave so confidently? Why do many of them still hold up better than modern formulations created in the age of chemistry and precise formulas? This isn't a coincidence or a lucky batch. It's a recurring result, appearing again and again in museum collections. A strange picture emerges. The world described to us as simpler and more limited seems to have possessed recipes that produced effects which later became either rare or entirely unattainable. And if the dyes themselves already look suspicious, the situation gets even worse. Because dye doesn't just appear in an aristocrat's wardrobe by itself. It had to be delivered. Which means behind all this luxury, there must have been enormous logistics, traces of which are strangely almost invisible where they should have remained. This raises a question particularly uncomfortable for the conventional view of the past. If Europe truly was awash in silk, velvet, brocade, expensive linings, trims, threads, and dyes, where are the traces of this giant supply system? Not pretty words about trade, but real infrastructure. Where are the documents for constant raw material imports? Where are the records of warehouses packed with bolts of cloth? Where is the information on caravans, ships, guards, transshipment points, insurance payments, losses in transit? All of this should have existed on a scale that would make archives tremble. We're not talking about a few rare deliveries for a coronation. We're talking about a flow that had to run without stopping. Courts couldn't wait half a year for new shipments to cross seas and borders. Fashion changed quickly. Ceremonies followed one after another. Court life demanded constant renewal of outward splendor. So somewhere, a well-oiled supply system must have been working, almost like the circulatory network of a vast organism. But where you expect to see its traces, you often find silence, or numbers that are too small for such luxury. The disconnect between the result and the paper trail looks especially strange. Portraits, inventories, wardrobes, and surviving fabrics speak of incredible consumption. Yet the documentary record, if we believe the official version, looks as if it served a far more modest world. Not an empire of luxury, but a market of expensive rarities for a narrow circle. It's here that suspicion begins to arise, that we're looking not at the full picture, but at its display window. As if we're shown the facade of trade and craftsmanship, but behind it lies another source. Because if neither the production volumes nor the traces of supply add up, then the answer must be sought not only in the archives. It will have to be sought in the fabrics themselves. And they, if you look closely, hint at yet another problem. A complexity of patterns that becomes almost impossible to explain as handcrafted. It is in the patterns that the official version begins to lose its footing almost completely. While the discussion was about quantity, one could argue, inflate or deflate estimates, point to wealthy courts and the exceptional skill of individual artisans. But when you look at the fabric's design itself, the debate becomes much more intense. Here, it is no longer a matter of taste, but of precision. On old brocades and silks, one finds patterns that repeat with an almost frightening regularity. The line runs straight. The repeat holds without faltering. Complex elements return again and again, as if guided not by a human hand, but by a predetermined system. And this is not a crude geometric motif that could be patiently repeated from memory. These are multi-layered compositions with interwoven details, symmetry, complex transitions, and an exact rhythm in the design. This is where the most uncomfortable question arises. How exactly was this done by hand on those very simple looms shown to us in textbooks? Because manual work, however skillful, always leaves a human trace, a micro-flaw, a tremor, a minor inaccuracy, the fatigue of the hand. That is normal. That is the very nature of craftsmanship. But in a number of old textiles, we see not an artisanal imperfection, but an almost machine-like discipline. Samples where the pattern is not just beautiful, but technically complex in its very logic of execution, look especially strange. There, it is not enough to say the master was talented. Talent does not override the limitations of the tool. If an ornament requires precise control of many threads simultaneously, then what we are looking at is either a technology far surpassing the officially permissible level of the era, or items whose origin is not fully explained to us. And this is not the limit of the strangeness, because if the pattern itself seems too perfect, then the materials come into play, making the task almost unbelievable. It is one thing to repeat a pattern with ordinary thread, and quite another to weave metal, the finest embellishments, and details of such complexity into the fabric that the entire history begins to look even more tangled. It is especially difficult to explain not just fabric, but fabric into which something is woven that itself requires a separate technology. We are talking about gold and silver threads, about the most intricate embellishments, about lace that in portraits looks almost weightless, yet obeys an ironclad precision. This is no longer a matter of taste. This is a matter of production, and at a level that poorly aligns with the image of a semi-artisanal craft world. To obtain real metallic thread for fabric, it is not enough to take metal and make it thin. It must be drawn, aligned, and processed so that it does not break, does not tear the base, does not turn clothing into crude armor. Then this material must be woven into a pattern where a mistake would immediately stand out. And all this was supposedly done in an era described to us as a time of simple tools and slow workshops. Moreover, not as a rare curiosity, but in such quantities that shining threads are found again and again all across Europe. With lace, the situation is even more severe. The production speed there must have been almost painfully low. The finest work, a minute rhythm, a complex pattern requiring immense time and extreme attentiveness. But then a direct question arises. Where were the armies of craftswomen providing such a flow of embellishment? Where are the traces of their lives, their centers, their giant workshops? If all this were truly created by hand in the necessary volumes, entire regions would have had to live on this alone. And here, a critical mass of doubt accumulates. Metallic threads do not align with primitive technique. Lace does not align with the scale of consumption. And yet, the luxury is right before us. It hasn't gone anywhere. Therefore, one can no longer limit the discussion to craftsmanship. One must look at the price of the matter, because when the technology seems impossible, it remains to check the money. And there, the picture becomes even more troubling. Money in this story speaks no quieter than the fabrics themselves. As soon as the conversation shifts from the world of beauty to the world of expenses, luxury immediately ceases to seem like merely a whim of the nobility. It turns into an economic anomaly. One ceremonial dress costs so much that an ordinary family could live for a very long time on that sum. Now imagine not one dress, but dozens of obligatory outfits for receptions, ceremonies, balls, seasonal appearances, visits to court. Multiply this by the number of courtiers, by the families of the high nobility, by all the major courts of Europe, and you get not just expensive fashion, but a bottomless vortex into which colossal wealth must have been draining. The official version requires a strange faith from us. We must accept that the elite regularly spent sums of almost monstrous scale on clothing, yet the financial system did not choke. Markets did not plunge into crisis, and states continued to wage wars, build palaces, maintain administration and fleets. In other words, textile luxury must have been consuming resources at a level difficult to reconcile with the stability of the economy of that time. The most inconvenient part here is that clothing was not an eternal treasure carefully preserved for centuries. It was remade, updated, adapted to fashion, turned into new items, lost, spoiled, given away. This means the money was not going into one great reserve, but into constant consumption. Almost as if someone, for generations, was burning a fortune not on construction, not on weapons, not on land, but on external glitter. The logic here pushes toward a stark conclusion. Either the real costs were nothing like what they should have been with honest production and honest procurement, or the main source of this luxury lay outside the ordinary economy. And after this, the version of a hidden origin for the fabrics ceases to look like fantasy. It begins to seem like an attempt to plug several holes with one explanation. If one tries to gather all the inconsistencies into one scheme with a single stroke, a version emerges that academic history usually dismisses immediately. Too inconvenient, too dangerous for the familiar picture of the world. What if a significant portion of these fabrics was not produced in the declared volumes, but was found already finished, not woven at court, but extracted from storages left by a different era? Then, suddenly, many things begin to fall into place without strain. It becomes clearer why the volumes of manual labor and the actual level of consumption do not match. Why archives are not bursting with documents about raw material imports and constant supplies. Why the quality of the fabric in places looks as if it came not from an artisanal workshop, but from a system with a different technological foundation. And even the economic paradox no longer seems like a dead end. If the main mass of luxury was not bought at a real price, but obtained through access to ready-made reserves, then the colossal expenditures cease to be a necessary condition. Especially strange against this backdrop are the old basements of palaces, residences, and administrative buildings. Vast, vaulted spaces stretching deep underground, with stable temperatures, dim lighting, and conditions perfectly suited for the long-term storage of delicate materials. We are told these are merely service levels, wine cellars, supply storerooms. But the scale of some of these spaces seems excessive even for a very wealthy court. And if we imagine a major catastrophe of the past, after which some structures were buried under clay, silt, and layers of sediment, the very idea of preserved underground reserves ceases to seem like madness. On the contrary, it begins to look like one of the few versions capable of tying together the volume, quality, and silence of the archives. Then an even heavier question arises. Who exactly gained access to these repositories first? And is this not, perhaps, where the new elite grew from? Those who declared themselves the rightful owners of someone else's inheritance. If we look at old reforms and manufactories from this perspective, the familiar history begins to sound completely different. We are told, the sovereign changed the country's appearance, imposed new tastes, broke old habits, pulled the elite toward a European model. All this is presented as a cultural leap, a sharp turn toward progress. But if behind the facade of fashion lay the distribution of already discovered reserves, then the meaning of many decisions becomes far more down-to-earth and harsh. A sudden change in attire might not have been a matter of taste, but a matter of access control. Some were forced to wear new clothes not because the old was considered backward, but because the new needed to be urgently put into circulation, legitimized, made the norm. Whoever controlled the fabrics controlled the symbols of power. Appearance ceased to be merely clothing. It became a sign of admission into a new system. Then the manufactories themselves no longer look like the primary source of luxury, but like second-tier workshops. Not a place where miracles were created from scratch, but a place where they were adapted to current needs. Resewn, recut, fragments joined, trimmings changed, old material adjusted to new styles. This neatly explains why documents pay so much attention to finishing, embroidery, and recutting, and so little clarity exists where a giant raw material base should have been. A curious picture emerges. For the public, craftsmanship, workshops, demonstrative work, the official showcase. For the inner circle, access to reserves whose origins are better left undiscussed. And if this scheme is at least partially true, then something else becomes clearer. Why there remains a strange wariness around old textiles, museum collections, and serious independent examinations. Because one precise analysis can sometimes be more dangerous than a dozen loud books. And here the debate about old fabrics ceases to be just a conversation about fashion, tastes, and rich attire. What lies before us is no longer a private oddity, but a trace of something much larger. Excessively luxurious portraits, excessively large volumes, excessively high material durability, excessively complex patterns, excessively quiet archives, excessively convenient explanations. Individually, one might still try to write these off as rare exceptions, calculation errors, or the skill of individual artisans. But together, these details begin to form a picture that looks entirely different. If buildings could have been found and repurposed, if basements could have stored more than just wine and grain, if the aristocracy truly utilized a ready-made inheritance, then textiles become not an ornament of an era, but evidence. Not a symbol of flourishing, but a remnant of an alien system that was later appropriated, renamed, and integrated into a new official history. And then it becomes clearer why artists so stubbornly rendered every fold, every gleam, every thread. They might not have understood the full nature of these things themselves, but they sensed their true value. The most uncomfortable aspect for the conventional version is that such questions do not disappear just because they are inconvenient to ask. On the contrary, the more closely you look, the stronger the feeling that what lies before us is not a whim of a wealthy era, but a fragment of a larger civilization whose technologies and scale we still do not fully understand. So next time you see an old formal portrait, don't look at the face, look at the fabric. Sometimes it tells the truth louder than any textbook. If this analysis made you think, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and be sure to click the bell so you don't miss future content. Write in the comments which historical paradox to explore next. Until next time.